Thanks very much, David. So I'm referred to as co-organizer. I think that's hardly just, since David did all the work. I think we sort of, I guess, jointly generated the idea and sort of, and some of the attendees, but I'm really very grateful to David for all of his efforts in terms of logistics and invites and everything like that. I feel like I just want to add a few thanks to David. Obviously, again, to thank David, also to thank the Constitutional Court for hosting us yesterday, the University of Johannesburg, Professor Mwala, Professor O'Brien, for so nicely hosting us. SAFAC, the IACL, Conrad Adenauer, I'm really grateful to all of the support for hosting a conference that I think both David and I are very excited about. So I want to be very brief because I want to get to the panels, but we thought it would be useful perhaps in this slot to very, very briefly, I guess, reflect a little bit on some of the themes that came out yesterday and where we might be going today with the last couple of panels of the conference. So let me just very, very briefly touch on, I guess, three themes. The first really is sort of the broad sense of shifts or evolutions in the separation of powers that we observed yesterday. And I think the last two panels in particular got a pretty clear consensus on a couple of points. One is that legislative power has been reduced significantly, and in some sense even more deeply, legislative legitimacy seems to have been reduced significantly in modern times. At the same time, executive power seems to be on the increase, right, in a number of ways. And I think there are a number of factors for this, right? Some of which are just related, that came out, just basic kind of modernization trends. In a way, maybe it's inevitable that gives the executive more power, the legislature less. These are trends that have been going on not that recently, really, right? But over the broad course of the 20th century. At the same time, there may be things that have gone on kind of more recently, trends in party politics, also sort of trends in global political events, right? The impact of 9/11 on executive power perhaps was significant. The creation of sort of broader security states in the hands of the executive. Even events like the growth of regional organizations, particularly the European Union, may have contributed to the growth of executive power. The implications, I think, of this sort of somewhat obvious shift, I think, right, on the separation of powers strike me as profound, potentially. For one thing, at the broadest level, one could talk about, as Vicky mentioned yesterday, what this means for constitutionalism if we think that liberal constitutional projects put legislatures in their center. And I think that they do at a symbolic level and also at a very real level. This is the democratic part of the Constitution. If these are institutions that have lost legitimacy and that are sort of in search of a role, that potentially has profound implications for what constitutionalism ought to look like and what ought to be at the center. It's not the legislature, right? I'm not sure it's right to say it's not, but if it's not so clear what's, what is there at the heart. And the other thing is, I think it puts a lot of pressure on both courts and fourth branch institutions in some ways to play a checking role that in some ways has been lost by legislative functions. And yet there's not a lot of clarity, I think, really on either point, right? So the fourth branch institutions, I thought that panel was fascinating precisely because of the variety of roles that these institutions play. And in some sense, then, maybe we're still in search of a theory of what it is that fourth branch institutions ought to be doing and why. How they ought to be complementing essentially constitutional courts. It seems true that just having them play court-like functions may not be the best use, right? But then the question is, so what do they do? Is it a kind of mediation role, as Ross suggested, right, or is it something else? And for judiciaries as well, there seems to be some agreement that this requires more out of courts perhaps than we required in the past. But what exactly that is and how to kind of make that a normative theory of role is unclear. And I think it also should be said there's nothing automatic that suggests that courts are going to become more powerful just because they kind of need to be more powerful to check executives, right? It seems like in some ways one might fear the opposite, right? That the growth of executive power kind of impinges on or makes it less likely. In other words, the loss of separation of powers between the executive and the legislature may make it less likely, actually, that you're going to get powerful judiciaries. A couple other just sort of themes to touch on very briefly that I think are reflected in the last two panels of the conference for today. One is just the extent to which we see or want to discuss or really emphasize a north-south difference in some ways, right? To use the term sort of too loosely, perhaps. On the one hand, you can see that these trends are broad; they run across countries, right? Lots of problems from the growth of executive power, the loss of legislative legitimacy, distrust in political institutions, perhaps a sort of crisis in party systems. All of these things seem to run broadly across a range of political systems. Certainly one could observe them in the United States, for example, many of these trends. And so the question, I think, is, to the extent we want to talk about evolutions in the separation of powers, does it differ at all between more established, older constitutional orders and more fragile or newer constitutional orders? And I'm not sure, right? I think that there may still be some differences, right? But they may be subtler than one would have thought sort of coming in. Certainly there are different projects, right? The existence, as David talked about at length yesterday, of social rights jurisprudence and the need for a robust social rights jurisprudence in the Global South may require courts to do different things or more robust things in some ways. Similarly, Manuel Jose and I were talking about this a bit on the bus last night. There may be, although there is distrust of political institutions everywhere, there's a kind of constitutionalism, perhaps, centered around distrust of political institutions in the Global South that means something for judicial rule. I still think you need to tease out whether that difference is really there and how big it is, right? But potentially one could suggest that as a basis for a difference. And then a last theme, which will be picked up, I think, by the last panel of the conference, is the extent to which doctrinal discussion of judicial role, separation of powers, matters, or the extent to which, in reality, it's all a product, essentially, of political institutions. In other words, we all should just be studying political science and put down the law. I wear both hats, so that makes me schizophrenic on this point, I think, right, in some ways. On the one hand, I think political institutions matter a great deal, right? Clearly, they constrain courts in all sorts of ways. Very interesting sort of discussion or interchange between Stu Woolman and Renata yesterday about the extent to which courts could actually make a difference or sort of settle separation of powers disputes. And of course, in lots of political contexts, the sort of overbroad court runs the risk of backlash. At the same time, I think it's really, it strikes me, and this is the legal side of me, I guess, it strikes me as really important to discuss the ways in which courts can be effective despite constraints, right? And some of this maybe, as Renata mentioned yesterday, skillful use of judicial decisions to build allies, right? Or interventions that are timed in some ways to build up support. I'm not really sure, but I think that the issue is really worth discussing, the extent to which the doctrinal discussion actually bears on reality, the extent to which it's all just captured by politics. All right, so thank you very much, and look forward to the discussion.
The University of Johannesburg. Rethink, reinvent.